Hey guys, Mark here. I thought it might be a little bit helpful if I was to actually visually walk you through how to take a more complex sentence in Latin. Keep in mind what I mean by more complex is not that the grammar really works any differently than any other sentence. Remember that any Latin sentence consists of one or more kernels, and everything that's not a kernel item is a modifier, and there are only two kinds of modifiers: adverbial, modifiers that tell you more about the verb in the kernel, and adjectival, modifiers that tell you about a noun. So it's really that simple in any Latin sentence. The thing that makes Latin sentence start to look longer and more complex is when you start adding more kernels, for one thing, but also when you start adding more complex kinds of modifiers. So instead of individual adverbs and adjectives, which are just one word, you start getting things like prepositional phrases and dependent clauses and relative clauses and other kinds of phrases like ablative absolutes, which add a lot more words, um, but they're still just acting as modifiers of various kinds. So they're either big long adverbs or big long adjectives. So when I'm talking about a more complex sentence, what I mean is one that has more modifiers in it and more complex kinds of modifiers in it. But the basic grammar is always the same: a kernel and adverbs and adjectives. So let's take a look at this one. And I want to show you how I might go through and mark this up in order to make it easier to deal with as a reader. So the first thing, and this is particularly, I think, helpful if you're a Latin beginner, whenever you're faced with a complex sentence, the first thing to do is to bracket off phrases and clauses, because you know phrases and clauses are not going to be part of the main kernel. Um, so if you can bracket those off visually, then it's much easier to see where your main kernel items are. So the first thing I'm going to do here is look for anything that looks like a phrase or a clause. So I've got a Hercules at the beginning of the sentence. That's looking pretty nounish and pretty nominative. So that's probably a kernel item. And then I get ubi in sylvis cerum vidit. And we know from an earlier chapter that ubi here is a clause marker for a dependent clause. So if I've got that there, that's going to raise a little red flag in my mind that I might be starting out a dependent clause if I've got a preposition like that in the sentence. And sure enough, I parse along with the next few words and I find a nice verb here, vidit, um, which means I have got myself a nice little dependent clause sitting here. So I'm going to bracket that off because I know that a dependent clause is not going to be part of my kernel. I've also got two words in the ablative case, ablative plural here, which means those are going to be some kind of modifier. So I'm going to bracket those off as well. And then I get curere, an infinitive verb, and incepit, just regular old third person singular verb. Those are probably kernel items too, since they don't appear to be part of any clause. Then I've got neque, tempus ad quietem reliquit. So first of all, I can bracket off ad quietem because there's a preposition and an accusative, so I can bracket that off right away as a prepositional phrase, leaving me with what are probably kernel items, right? So I've got reliquit here, which is a verb, and then I've got tempus. So now I can start marking up my kernel items, which I usually do too. So normally what I do is I'll take subjects especially and give them a nice single underline, so I know that's my subject. I'll take verbs and circle them, especially if they're a main verb. So curere, incepit. And notice here that if I've got Hercules began to run, that's an intransitive kernel. So that means that's my complete kernel there. Hercules, curere, incepit. I don't need anything else. It's an intransitive kernel, so I don't need a direct object, which means sumis viribus and ubi in sylvis cerum vidit are modifiers. As I know, usually when I have a clause marker like ubi, that's the marker for a dependent clause, which is always going to be an adverbial modifier. And then sumis and viribus are both in the ablative case, and we know that ablatives always make nouns work adverbally. So we know that those are going to be adverbial modifiers as well. which means we can put the whole first part of the kernel together. So let's do a diagram for the first part of that kernel. Forgive my really cheap graphics tablet here, but I think it'll be clear. So our subject, as we've already noted, is Hercules. And then since it's an intransitive kernel, all we need to represent is our verb, which is correre incepit. And that's our entire kernel. We've just identified, too, that everything else we've got is some kind of adverbial modifier in the sentence. So let's take sumis viribus first, which is just regular old ablatives. So we've got viribus, which is a noun. And then, of course, sumis is an adjective agreeing with it. So we've got something like that. But then we've got something else adverbial. And notice that instead of being a phrase like viribus sumis, this is a clause, which means it has its own kernel. So we can look at the kernel for that clause and look at our kernel items there. The first thing you notice we can do is bracket off in siluis, because that's just a good old-fashioned prepositional phrase with a noun and the ablative. Vidit is obviously our verb, and ceruum is looking awfully accusative, which means we've got a kernel that looks like this. We've got a gapped Hercules, that's still the subject. Vidit is our verb. And then we have a direct object. Ceruum. And then, of course, in siluis is itself an adverbial modifier, so we'll just drop that down like any old prepositional phrase off of the verb. Now, notice with neque here, we've got a ne, which is a negator, and then a que, which is just a regular old and, which is part of what's telling us that we have two connected kernels in this sentence. So let's deal with our other kernel. We'll put the que here to show that that's our connecting conjunction. We're keeping the same subject, which is Hercules. And remember, so we can circle our main verb here, which is reliquit. And then tempus, remember, tempus can be is a neuter noun, which means that it's going to have the same form in both the nominative and the accusative cases. So how do we know whether this is nominative or accusative? Well, the most important clue is context here, which is that Hercules is doing one thing, Hercules began to run, and left or didn't leave. So the main thing is that we've already got something that's functioning as a very clear subject. Also, Hercules is not ambiguous as to its case. Hercules can only be nominative. It's never going to be accusative or anything else, whereas we know that tempus can be either one. So the likelihood here is that tempus is accusative, and it's the direct object of the verb reliquit. So putting it together that way, we can take care of our entire kernel. So Hercules, gapped, is our subject. Reliquit is our verb. Tempus is our accusative direct object. And then once again, everything else that we have left over is adverbial. And we have two things left over. We have this ad quietem, prepositional phrase, preposition with an accusative. And then we've got ne, which is just a negator, regular old adverb. So we'll drop the ne down off of reliquit, and then we'll drop our prepositional phrase down off of reliquit. And then all we have to do is take what we understand about the Latin grammar and put it together in a way that makes sense in English. So reading our kernels here, we've got Hercules, ubi, I should put that there, when he saw the deer in the forest, began to run with great strength. And Hercules did not, nay, leave time, tempus, for rest, ad quietem. So there we've got our whole sentence put together.